There are three parties in the room. There's the Democrats, the Republicans, and then there's the American people. And so when you hear bipartisan, what I want you to think is a Dem-Republican uniparty deal, where the third party, the American public, is very much not at the table.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Richard Stern, welcome to the Signal Sitdown.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Of course. You are the director of Heritage Foundation's Budget Policy Shop. Couldn't imagine a better time to have you on the show because Republicans are staring a budget reconciliation process right in the face. And it looks like a lot of them want to blink, but the president is standing behind them saying, if you turn and run, if you blink, you'll have to answer directly to me. As we speak, the Republican House Conference is currently in Doral, Florida at the President's Resort, meeting, figuring out exactly how they're going to get this budget reconciliation through Congress. A lot of, I think, really complex minutia to get into with budget reconciliation. I think, the American people mostly understand this is the shot that Republicans have to enact the MAGA agenda since they do not have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. And so that means that they need to get 50 plus 1 in the Senate to get it through, to get it across the line. But they have razor-thin margins in both the House and the Senate. So I guess to start this conversation, let's talk about some objectives, right? What actual parts of the MAGA agenda are going to find their way, or the big buckets of this budget reconciliation?
So I thank you for having me on to talk about this. I can't stress enough, as you pointed out, this is the one shot we have to really get all these things done. And really, almost all of the agenda can and should be in this bill. As Trump likes to say, one big, beautiful bill. But that's both border security, it's interior and immigration enforcement, deportations, but it's also permitting reform, regulatory reform, deregulation, unleashing our energy resources. We could go after the deep state. We could dismantle the deep state if we really wanted to. And then, of course, there's other pro-growth things dealing with tax policy, extending the Trump tax cuts so that families don't see a $3,000, $4,000 tax bill increase next year, and making sure that our small and large businesses can continue to invest in America, building jobs here. And of course, we could actually deal with trade policy as well in a reconciliation bill. That's just a handful of the things that are easily on the table.
Now, they want to put handcuffs on this process, the Democrats, the establishment, however you want to label them. The budget reconciliation process cannot do everything, we are told, but it's a little bit of a matter of interpretation. What are the handcuffs on the budget reconciliation process? And are these steel handcuffs and you're in the back of a cop car, or are they Chinese handcuffs that you bought from a dollar store?
They're Chinese handcuffs from a dollar store. So here's the thing about this. Reconciliation started out as a process 50 years ago that was meant to be able to tweak the budget process. In fact, the reason it's called reconciliation is it's supposed to be there to reconcile differences between where the budget is and where you plan for the budget to be. But the truth is the guidelines around it, the restrictions, first, it is actually up to the Senate whether they want to follow them or not. So at some level, they could just vote to waive whatever rules they want about it. In fact, some of them, they're already in deep conversation about doing that. But, the other thing, I just want to give one quick example on this, is that a lot of these things you can't do directly, but you can do indirectly. Perfect example on this is you talk to members, you talk to staffers, they'll tell you you can't go after the deep state because it's mostly what's called discretionary money. It's a pot of money that's typically off the table for reconciliation purposes. I'll tell you what isn't, though. You have these NGOs that are getting discretionary money to traffic people into the country, that traffic drugs in. You could tax them to just effectively claw back all of the discretionary grant money they get. That's one of those, where if you're a little creative about it, you can really do any of the things we need to do.
Okay, that's interesting. When you say that the Congress can reconsider all sorts of rules that are put on this process, what type of vote would that take? What type of process would that look like to just say, hey, we're going to tweak the rules here, we're going to tweak the rules there, right? Is this because this process is governed by the Budget Act of 1974?
Well,
Do you need to amend that act and get a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, or is that something that you can change without 60 senators?
So here's the interesting thing about this. So reconciliation, as you're talking about, it's part of the Budget Act. It's a part of statute. However, the actual reconciliation process is a rule of the Senate. So what happens is what's in law is a whole set of requirements around something that is considered privileged as a reconciliation package under Senate rules. The Senate, on the other hand, though, could just vote to amend their rules or waive their rules temporarily to declare something as being privileged as a reconciliation bill. So it only needs 50 votes in advance and not 60 votes. And they can do that at their discretion because the Constitution demands that both chambers always have the ability with a simple majority vote to change their rules. No statute can ever override a majority vote in either chamber to change their rules. So they can do that if they would like, whenever they would like, with just a majority vote in the Senate.
So I guess that brings a lot of people to like, why aren't they doing this already? I know you said that they're probably talking about it right now. Maybe you've been involved in some of those conversations. I don't know, but like, I think the base sits there and says, well, this is our one shot to do as much as we can. Why haven't Republicans already said, yeah, I mean, if we need to change the rules to get this thing done, we have a mandate from the American people. This isn't 2017 reprise. This is a whole new ballgame for us, and we need to act. And I think a lot of them got that message loud and clear on Friday night when obviously Mitch McConnell joined Murkowski and Susan Collins on voting against Secretary Hegseth's confirmation. Republicans, I guess, just don't have the votes?
Well, that's the question about this, which is exactly how loud and clear did they receive the message on that. But, I'll tell you, I've been around watch this for a long time. The 60 vote threshold in the Senate both has good and bad to it. And really what this comes down to is the Senate has kind of, the best way I can explain it is a pious kind of belief in preserving this 60 vote threshold. But, what I would encourage people to look at, of course, is when does a party have 60 votes? And it tends to be when there's some kind of crisis. And so one side or the other, and to be frank, it's always the left, has 60 votes because they've been able to capture the American public in a sense of emergency and in a sense of crisis. Never a foreign crisis, but a domestic crisis. And so the left is always able to use these manufactured crises to get control of the Senate chamber when they can. So what was the last thing? There was major legislation that had this bipartisan unity that got through a 60-vote majority in the Senate. Obamacare. A massive regulation of every inch of our lives, of our economy, something that dismantled an enormous amount of the healthcare system, that has raised premium prices. That's the last time that you had a, quote, bipartisan group of people, enough support in the Senate to clear the 60 votes on something that wasn't perfunctory or naming post offices. So I think what you asked is exactly the question, which is how loud and clear have the conservatives in the chamber heard this message? How committed are they really to getting the agenda done, to preserving the country?
Mm-hmm. One thing I want to go back on is you said there are certain things, discretionary buckets that you can't touch directly, but you need to be creative in how you go after it. Why can't, if this is a rule and the Senate is free to change those rules, well, why can't we change the discretionary rule? Is that something that's laid out in the statute and so it's a little bit insulated, or like how does that actually interact with the policymaking process? Because if I'm looking at a budget reconciliation process and I'm someone who voted for President Trump, wants Republicans to enact his agenda, I see this and I'm thinking, you can't go after the deep state with discretionary spending when you're making your own rules for this process. It seems like you should just say anyone who objects to going after the deep state, take a hike. We're doing it anyway.
Yeah, it's almost as if the deep state set up the rules so you couldn't go after the deep state. So I'm with you on that. It is part of the statute, but again, all of reconciliation is both part of the statute and subject to a majority vote of the Senate to be like, I don't care. Mm-hmm. So the Senate could actually at any moment say, I don't care, we're going after it. But within the rules of it, basically it works like this. The rules on reconciliation have a few different parameters, but kind of the two most important ones, I think, for the audience to know is provisions in a reconciliation bill have to have what is called a non-incidental budgetary impact. What does that mean? It's anybody's guess. And that's been a thing that's debated in precedent through actually adjudicating with a Senate parliamentarian over 50 years now of reconciliation bills. Then the second thing is there's certain budget parameters, deficit parameters you have to abide by, and outside the 10-year window, you can't have deficits from the bill at all. So the reason why Trump's tax bill is expiring at all is to comply with those budget requirements and to make sure that outside the 10-year window, you don't have deficits. But going back to the non-incidental budgetary part of this. So basically, it needs to be a provision that's in the bill that is deemed to kind of directly and majority focus be about either changing spending levels or revenue levels. It's a little wonky, but the way that basically all of the regulatory agencies are funded is an indirect process. So Congress makes money available over here, creates the department and gives them authorization over here, and then they can use the authorization to dip into effectively their credit card balance. But because changing the credit card balance isn't directly changing what they spend, it's a incidental change if you go after discretionary money. Now, does this sound to you like the deep state set this up so they'd be insulated? Absolutely.
Right.
And in my opinion,
As
that's
long
exactly what this is.
As long as the balance is larger than the expenditure, well, then they get away scot-free. So then how do you actually, you said, you could set up taxes for these NGOs that receive state funds. Like, how does that actually work around? Is that because when with the authorization that they have to dip into that credit card that credit card balance, now Congress is backfilling it with a mandatory clawback, right? Like that's directly changing the revenue that Congress is getting for those specific programs. I mean, how is
precisely?
That? Okay.
Imagine being one of these left-wing communist NGOs whose purpose in life is to take, and by the way, we literally spend $14 billion a year of American taxpayer money to hand it to NGOs to funnel people and drugs across the border, right? It's insane. But imagine you're one of these communist NGOs and your existence is to take billions of dollars from the federal government and spend it in that manner. So reconciliation with its own rules can't go after the discretionary money as it's being handed to you. But we can go to you as a private entity and say, great, we're going to impose a tax on you that happens to be equal to all of the grant money you get from the federal government to do human trafficking. Mm-hmm. So you get the grant money in one hand, and then you have to pay it back to the IRS immediately, and you can't use it to actually funnel people through the border. But you can do that, by the way, when it comes to universities that take grant money and push, the woke agenda and support terrorists. You could do that to these entities that sue to stop oil and gas drilling, right? Who take federal funds and then sue to stop construction projects of factories and mines and oil wells. You can go after them that way. I mean, frankly, one of the things I've pushed is that you could actually impose a tax on federal bureaucrats and claw back their salaries, right? Literally have a DC cartel bureaucrat swamp tax and use that as a pay for, right, to cover the deficits in the bill to pay for all the money we need to secure the border and deport people.
Yeah, the swamp rat tax targeting rodents of unusual size.
Exactly. Right.
I like that. But you mentioned it, right? Like the deep state stuff is kind of the meta level. And now we get back to our buckets, right? You talked a little bit about how that meta level deep state stuff, you can use this, you can be creative and go after the immigration issue, you can go after the energy issue, you can go after tax issues, debt issues. But when I think the American people look at this, there's very specific policies that Donald Trump ran on, that Republicans ran on in the 2024 election cycle. And they might not necessarily want a workaround to attack they want to attack the deep state and they want to do the workaround, whatever is possible to attack it. But they would like a little bit more direct action on the deep state. And so how much of the direct policies that the Trump administration ran on, how much of that will actually be able to find its way in to the budget reconciliation process in, let's say, the crystal meth version of it rather than the cannabis version, which is the workaround, right? They want it hard.
Yeah, exactly.
This is the hard stuff that we're talking about. Yeah. That's what the MAGA base wants. That's what the Republican base wants. That's what the American people, because Donald Trump won the popular vote and Republicans have control of both chambers, Like that's what they want.
Yeah.
So is there?
I-
Can you actually do it?
So I actually think the vast majority of the agenda you could do directly. No workarounds, the pure version of it. So I think when it comes to building a border security infrastructure, getting more agents on the ground, that you can absolutely do in reconciliation. Being able to provide the resources to do interior enforcement, really find these people, deport them, to find the criminals, to root out the gangs and cartels, that you can fund through reconciliation. That really should be no problem. Anybody who tells you otherwise is doing the deep state's work.
Because it seems like any American looking at what has happened to the border over the last 4 years knows that there is a massive and direct budgetary impact on the United States. I mean,
absolutely.
People in Springfield, Ohio, let's leave the pet community out of it for a second, right? The people of that community saw their emergency services absolutely destroyed and strained.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, let alone just the sheer cost to the psyche of the country, the cost in lives. I mean, the damage being done is incalculable, right? We're looking at this junta of global elites who hate this country, who hate our founding values, who frankly and tragically hate the people of the United States, who have done everything they can to import in terrorists and cartels, to import in the violence and the chaos of the third world into the U.S. to assault America and to assault American values. So, and I'll tell you, this is where you and I think agree on this one. Screw the rules on this. Get this done.
Right. As JD Vance said over the weekend, I don't care, Margaret.
Exactly.
I'm screw the rules, right? You got to get this done.
Exactly.
But
But now, as I say, I think in terms of changing kind of deeper visa law, that you can't directly do in reconciliation. Again, there might be creative ways of doing it, but changing exactly how H-1B visas work, or changing how many people can get on chain migration, for example, harder to do in reconciliation.
Why is that harder to do? Because I sit back and I look at the visa problem, whether it's a high skill visa or a low skill visa, and I say, well, a lot of importation of foreign labor is crowding out Americans from getting good jobs at steady wages in the workplace. And therefore, that means that we're passing up on good old American revenue, and like, not to mention whatever remittances are being paid through these visa programs back to the home country, right? If that money's not staying in the United States, you're not earning taxes on it via consumption, or, you're not putting that money in American financial institutions if they are saving that money. How does that not have a direct budgetary impact?
So this is the kind of bean counting litigiousness about reconciliation that feels very much designed to derail the agenda. It is about, as precisely as you can kind of think about it, first order impacts. So here's a perfect example on this. Does changing a visa, the rules around a visa, does that by itself change any of the revenues to the government? No. So everything you just talked about happens, but it is the second, third, fourth thing that happens after we've changed the visa. In fact, the way that the precedent of reconciliation is even having somebody come into the country is a second order effect from having changed the rules around a visa.
So let's say if I do change the rules around a visa and I say, okay, how many H-1B visas are we letting in right now? I forget the cap. What is it? 70,000 is like
85.
85? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's say I want to drop that to 45,000. Well, I've just made the actual visa process a lot cheaper. I've shrunk the amount of visas that we're giving out. So therefore I can shrink the workforce devoted to that work. The process becomes quicker. It becomes more efficient. It becomes cheaper. How is that not a first order effect?
Oh, no. So this is the thing. And this is the case law precedent of reconciliation. It's actually discretionary money that pays for the workforce. So changing the visas and changing how many people we keep just sitting at desks doing nothing on a federal payroll, all of those are the next things. They're indirect. You'd have to do it separately from the visa. This is the maddening frustration of how these rules and reconciliation work.
So nothing qualifies essentially as a direct impact when it comes to a visa program.
Exactly. Yep. Now, don't get me wrong. Creatively, you could just sell visas, and you could even say, look, if you meet these criteria, the visa's $1. And if you don't meet these, it's $10 billion for a visa. Right. So, I mean, you could do that. Right. And that's what I mean by creative. And some of these, to be fair, creative they're not quite pure crystal meth, but they're 1 inch away from it.
Right.
But it does, that's kind of the problem.
The barrier is so high that it's the same exact thing as if you enacted, a much lower cap.
Precisely.
Right?
Now, part of the case law on reconciliation, being frank with everybody here, is that the parliamentarian can look at, and if you did exactly that, right? So if you meet these criteria, it's $1, and if you don't, it's $1 trillion, right? The parliamentarian would probably look at that precisely and say, no, it isn't what you're doing. It's not mostly a budgetary thing. What you're doing is mostly shoehorning in a non-budgetary policy.
So the
And
Senate
then would rule it out,
parliamentarian,
right?
who is this? Is a very powerful person that no one knows anything about. I don't even know this person's name. I mean, what is the Senate parliamentarian's role in all of this? Because it seems like no one elected this person.
Oh yeah.
No one knows who this person is, and yet they have essentially a line item veto power, a power that we haven't even given to the president of the United States, the elected representative that we vested our power into, and yet they have that power. That doesn't make any sense to me.
So here's the thing I'm gonna say about this. It's not that Elizabeth, the parliamentarian, it's not that she has a line item veto. It's that she has a line item to grant permission to be lazy. And that's the trick here. So she serves at the pleasure of the Senate Majority Leader, and her rulings are just the parliamentary interpretation of things. It is actually up to Senate leadership. It's actually up to the majority of the Senate to vote on her rulings. So when I say it's not a veto, it's not a line item veto, it's a line item permission granting system, is she can rule unelected, unaccountable to voters, and the rest of the Senate can just turn around, look at the American people and say, oh, well, she said whatever, we got to go by that. It's permission to be lazy. It's permission to not implement the full agenda.
So I don't know Elizabeth. Apparently that's her name, and I'm sure she's a nice person. Seems like she's been able to keep both sides of the Senate on her side. You have to be a pretty nice person to do that here in Washington, D.C. But what if Senate Majority Leader John Thune, like how long has Elizabeth been in this position?
I don't even know off the top of my head, but she's been there through multiple different governments, different parties. She's been there for a long time.
Okay, so she's been there for a long time.
Yeah.
So what's stopping Senator Thune from saying, Elizabeth, thank you so much. We really appreciate you. We're going to change directions and meet your new Senate parliamentarian like Kash Patel. You know, like,
yeah.
What?
what's
this
stopping
is.
him?
I'm sure she's a wonderful person.
Oh yeah.
But why doesn't the Republican majority give themselves a Republican parliamentarian? Right? Like this is I think something that's everyone was, oh, you're making the government hyper-partisan. No, I think this is something that the founding fathers fully accounted for. The first Senate parliamentarians had dogs in the fight, for sure. They're political creatures as well.
Yep. And the answer to your question is nothing. It's the precedent of the Senate. It is the societal customs of the Senate. What I always tell people is the best way to really think about Senate rules is to think of it like a religious society. It's got its own religion. It's a pagan, undiscovered tribe, and that's what they do. And so she is a god within their religion, and the institution of it is, and the idea that to most of the Senate that you would swap out a parliamentarian to get rules that, I don't know, favor the country is outside of their customs on this. But by the way, if you want to go further down the rabbit hole, it's not just her. So we've been talking about things have to have a budgetary impact and you can't have deficits and whatever. You might be asking yourself, well, who rules on what causes a deficit or not? Who
That's exactly
does this scoring, right? It's the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, and the JCT, which is the Joint Committee on Taxation. It's a joint House and Senate committee in Congress. So then the question is, well, who runs these? Who works at these? Who does the scores? What rules do they both do their scoring under? Rules set by Congress. Congress could choose to put whomever they would like in charge of these entities. They can set the rules that they can use. In fact, so one of the big things in tax policy is we want to use dynamic scoring. So dynamic scoring is the simple proposition that we should actually gauge the scoring on tax bills by how much it actually harms or helps the economy. And at the moment, Congress, both sides of the aisle, force CBO and JCT to do what's called static scoring, which is the proposition that I can tax the absolute crap out of you and assume that you're still going to go to work in the morning, even if 100% of your paycheck goes to the federal government.
That extreme?
Yeah, literally that extreme. That's static scoring for you. And so that's the sort of thing right there where that should be an easy vote. And in fact, what's even stupider about this, right, is we passed Trump's tax cut bill the first time. Every economist you could talk to would have told you there's going to be almost no deficits from this because it's so good for growth. It's so good for increasing people's incomes, getting more investment in America. And actually, CBO privately said, yeah, that's exactly what we would think. But Congress prohibited us from using a dynamic score. And so CBO and JCT together put up a score of a $1.5 trillion deficit on the bill, which is why we could only expand it out to 7 years and had to make it expire after that, again, under the deficit rules of reconciliation. And then a couple months after it was passed, signed into law, their new economic outlook showed massive projected revenue growth, which happened in real life. Because in their economic outlook, they could be honest. But in formal scoring for reconciliation purposes, they couldn't be honest. And it is because both chambers of Congress simply didn't want to take the vote to change the rules.
So the JCT seems more straightforward. These are people who were elected by the American people, and they're coming together and figuring out exactly, the economic impact of these various policies, which is completely in their purview, and it's Republican, yada yada yada. And by Republican, I mean small r. The Congressional Budget Office, however, I don't know who runs that. Apparently they're appointed, but they're not elected. Why? From my reading on what the CBO is and does, is it essentially is an executive function created by the legislature as the executive and the executive branch has clawed more power unto itself, oftentimes just forked right over from Congress.
Yep.
And in response to this concentration of power in the executive branch, Congress decided that it needed executive entities of its own, essentially. And then you get things like the Congressional Budget Office, where everyone is super credentialed and very smart. And we assure you that they're not political whatsoever, and they're just the experts running the numbers. Nobody thinks that's true. What would be the process for changing how the CBO goes about its work?
Congress could just vote to change it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, a majority vote of Congress can change any of these sorts of parameters around things run by Congress. You really can think of the CBO kind of the way you're talking about as, in essence, another committee or an arm of Congress. But I'll tell you this.
But nobody's elected on it. That's the
exactly. Well,
right?
But in that sense, it's exactly like any other staff organism within Congress. In fact, at JCT, as much as the people who run the committee were elected, the staffers have been there for decades, some of them, right? And again, it's the staff of the committee who actually do the modeling work, right? Who actually run the numbers and publish them. Congress could change both of these things. And again, I think what you find, the longer you're in DC and you're looking at all this, and the more you're on the policy front lines, you realize that the solutions have been around for forever, that we know what the solutions are. The problem is a lack of willingness to actually tackle it. You've looked at decades of politicians who campaign on one thing, come to DC, turn around, look at their public and be like, man, I wish I could keep that promise, but we don't have some absurdly ridiculous benchmark of things. Well, why do you need to get the benchmark? Well, because we voted that we need that benchmark. And you realize that it's a game to be able to go home and get a win that's a narrow election majority, come here, lean on rules that arbitrarily exist, to then go back home and say, sorry, can't do it. There's some arbitrary thing that I don't feel like voting against.
So this is a lack of will, as you said. And it seems like it's a preference of institutions over people, and all these institutions are supposed to exist to serve the American people. The Constitution makes that fairly clear, as does the Declaration of Independence, right? That apple of gold in the frame of silver, as Lincoln once wrote. I think this is a super wonky conversation, and we kind of jumped right into the deep end, but I think we should backtrack. Right now, they're trying to figure out what's going to be in the budget resolution that's going to govern how they actually go about making policy. So if you could put on your Schoolhouse Rock hat and give us the simplified version of the process, and then circle back to the budget resolution part of it.
So the way that reconciliation works is that, first of all, it's generated by a budget resolution. Now, what's a budget resolution? It's a non-binding document that both houses of Congress pass to give their vision for all of the federal programs, all the federal spending, and exactly what they expect to happen over the next 10 years or so. And all of that is non-binding. There's a few things in there that become kind of operative for the funding bill, fights that happen. We just passed a CR in December. I'm sure many of your viewers here engaged, certainly on X, I did, along with Elon and Vivek, on that, trying to shrink the bill down. But we'll table that for the second. The other thing that comes out of a budget resolution are what are called the reconciliation instructions. So these are instructions to all of the other committees in Congress to require them to send in legislation to form this reconciliation package.
So the Energy Committee is going to be doing energy work. Homeland Security Committee is going to be doing stuff with the border.
Yep.
Yeah.
Precisely. Yep. And then all these committees send in things that comply with the instructions, and then that's the package.
And that's they let's say we'll call it a Frankenstein's monster, right? So the Budget Committee is in charge of putting together this Frankenstein's monster.
Yes.
Okay.
And making sure that it fits all the parameters of reconciliation, so that under the rules, the Senate only needs a majority vote, not a 60-vote threshold to pass the bill. That's the whole thing. And the instructions, by the way, are actually, maybe oddly enough, the simplest part of what is this very wonky process. The instructions are to a committee, either I want legislation from you that would increase the deficit by no more than a ceiling, or I need you to decrease the deficit by at least a floor. And that's it. And you pick the numbers. The ceiling for deficit allowance, or the minimum amount of deficit reduction they need to do. And you pick whether it's deficit increases or deficit reductions, and you pick the committee, and that's it.
So that's the instructions to a single committee, very simple.
Exactly.
Decrease the deficit or don't go beyond X. When you assemble all of those together, however, right, knowing whether or not to use the ceiling or the floor for the Homeland Security committees, or using the ceiling or the floor for the energy committees, that's where I think you get into the difficult realm of policymaking, right? So how do we know that the energy provisions that are going to be included in the budget reconciliation is going to decrease the deficit by X, and therefore we can take that decrease in deficit of X and take it over to the Homeland Security committees and say, okay, you can increase the deficit by the same amount that the Energy Committee's legislation is decreasing it.
This gets back to, what is the CBO score? What is the JCT score? And that's part of this. But it's also Congress's...
But that doesn't happen before the budget resolution is passed, right?
Well,
or is it?
So here's the interesting thing about this, and this is actually the thing that I think people ignore a lot about this. You set the budget resolution, you set these instructions, in theory, prior to having the bill you actually want to do. But again, part of this is, keep in mind, the process was originally envisioned as being, we set a budget that was going to be 1.1 trillion, and it's 1.1.5 trillion. And so we need to figure out how to deal with 50 billion on $1 trillion budget. Mm-hmm. It was meant for that. It wasn't designed to be a major legislative making process. So if you really want to do it, to do something like the MAGA America First policy agenda, then you have to control all ends of this at the same time. And so you're doing the budget resolution instructions with an eye towards what you think the scores are going to be and what you think the bill is going to be, and you need to make sure they sync up. Now, spoiler alert on this, the precise reason why Trump's tax bill is expiring is because we screwed up the reconciliation instructions the first time. Mm-hmm. The reason, at least thankfully, the Democrats were hindered in putting up their socialist agenda is they screwed up the reconciliation instructions. They actually screwed it up in a very surprising, and thank God for us, manner.
Even worse than Republicans?
Yes, actually.
Wow.
It's the first time. It never happens, but it happened there, right? So, that's part of this is, frankly, Congress right now is talking about, it's like, yeah, we'll do the resolution, then we'll get to the bill. If you screw up the resolution, you don't get the bill you wanted. Mm-hmm. That matters more than the bill in many respects.
So as we look at these various buckets, taxes, energy, immigration, foreign policy is not really going to be a part of it. I'd say those are the three major buckets. Yeah. Am I missing one? Of course, the deep state is the meta narrative, as we discussed. Deficit go up, deficit go down for each one of those buckets of policy.
So to fund all of the border, interior, immigration enforcement stuff, we would like, deficit goes up a smidge. The energy stuff, directly in terms of reconciliation scoring, deficits should go down by a smidge. Frankly, they should be in the ballpark of each other. Mm-hmm. But again, if we bring in dynamic scoring, the strength of the importance of strengthening our border security, of stopping these illegal flows, of right sizing our labor force, and making sure that we have a real control over what's going on, that we know what's going on, unleashing our energy resources, allowing the construction of power plants and factories. I mean, these things are going to have absolutely amazing impacts on growth. And that doesn't just mean massive federal revenue increases and a reduction of federal debt and deficit, but it means that workers will take home more pay. It means that there'll be more jobs available. It means there'll be better jobs available. But the other part of that is not just that the cost of living will come down, people will have more money, people will have more jobs, but by shrinking the deficit that way, it also means that interest rates will come down. Mortgage rates right now are 7%. The generation that is coming into trying to buy a home right now would never be able to afford a home if we keep the deficit high enough to keep mortgage rates above 7%. So you'll get absolutely amazing benefits from just doing border and energy like that. Now, the tax side of this probably is going to generate a lot of deficits, but again, you're doing it in a way that puts money back in people's pockets, that lets people keep the money they have earned.
Well, and then the one bucket that I did forget was trade. Trade is from what I see, and the president's trade agenda, this is you need to decrease the deficit by X floor. And it could be a whole lot more than that. So is trade where you're going to see an attempted offset in what happens to taxes? I know that the free marketeers are very excited about continuing the TCJA tax cuts. How you're going to fund them? Through tariffs? I don't think they're very excited about that. I'm thrilled because we just came off a weekend where Trump is checkmating every South American nation into taking back their criminals by just suggesting that we're going to tariff the hell out of them if we need it. We're going to tariff the hell out of you. And I'm very enthusiastic about that because I missed that from the White House instead of doing this corporate gobbledygook about the institutions and democracy. So, no, you're not taking your criminals back. We're going to tear the hell out of you. Anyway, I digress. The trade agenda paying for the tax cuts. Well, is that am I on the right track with that? Or
you are, but okay. I want to digress for 1 second, then I'll get back to that.
Okay.
I'll tell you what I think has been fascinating about watching the strategic tariff use. So not tariffs as a revenue raiser, but tariffs as a follow the rules and do what we're asking you to do. You know what's fascinating to me? The same people who are absolutely okay with having U.S. military bases everywhere, with sending our young, men and women to die on front lines, who are fine drone striking children in foreign countries, all of a sudden have a problem with using tariffs to negotiate geopolitical wins.
Can I say thank you for saying that? Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. And I think that shows you, by the way, that this group we're dealing with, they view their profits as more sacrosanct than human lives, ours, and also people in these other countries. So that's my view on that. And I think that's an important part of this, is that the people who are talking about that part of it as an insular tariff argument are missing the broader geopolitical part on this, right?
Yeah.
Now, getting back to the other question, though, about how we fund tax cuts, I'll tell you what's even more interesting to me about this. If you look at the public modeling that all the different free market groups have put out on, if you do this tax increase or cut, the economy does this or that, right? If you kind of sum it all up, what you find is, yes, they all think the tariffs are very negatively impactful on the economy. But if you say, okay, well, you're going to raise revenues on your model to bring in X number of dollars. If I then use X number of dollars to cut other taxes, what is the net effect on the economy? Even their models would tell you it's positive for the economy if you actually trade off tariffs for income tax cuts, even on their own models. But the other side of that is, so part of what's going on in Congress right now is there's a conversation going on about what's traditionally called a border adjustment tax system. So getting right back into the wonker on this one. People talk about tariffs, and we kind of talk about it as a blanket mechanism, but there really are 100 different ways to envision at the deep mechanical level how you do tariffs. So this is my favorite version of mechanically how to do this. If you think of it this way, the current way the international tax system works is that if you produce something in America and sell it here, we tax you. If you produce something in America and you sell it abroad, we tax you and they tax you. But if you
And
produce
if
something,
you stay in Ireland, you get no taxes.
you get no taxes. But here's the bigger thing about this. It's not even if you stay in Ireland. If you make something in Ireland and you sell it here, you pay no taxes. And so our system is set up where if you make it here and sell it here, make it here and sell it abroad, you face 1 or 2 layers of taxation. But if you make it there and you bring it here, it's a tax loophole. And that's because we have the only tax system on the planet that is not border adjusted. So what you want to do is tax all imports coming in, and you want to remove from taxation all exports going out. And then you have a level playing field.
So every other country does this.
Yes,
As far as I'm concerned.
absolutely.
And this seems a destruction of our manufacturing capacities by design.
Absolutely. Part of this, so I will say, the old line of never, associated with maliciousness, what can be easily explained by incompetence. A good chunk of the story is just pure incompetence, unfortunately. But, an original part of it is exactly that. It was a foreign aid program, in essence, to allow countries this kind of preferential tax treatment. And that made sense, maybe. I don't even think it did, but it maybe made sense right after World War II. Maybe it made sense for dealing with developing countries. But, under our own trade laws at the moment, we define China as a developing country, as a emerging country in need of our help to develop. That's how insane some of this is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's just shocking to me to see how simple the fixes could be if we had the political will to do it, which brings us, I think, to conversations about strategy and special interests.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is Washington, D.C. I used to work at an office right next to K Street. I see their types walking around the city, ghoulish types of all sorts, trying to influence the political process to serve their corporate overlords. We'll just say that. There's too many lawyers in this town, Richard, and we need to get rid of a lot of them. The one big, beautiful bill strategy, or there's the two bill strategy. I think right now, the MAGA base, the American people, will take either strategy. They don't really care as long as it gets done. So what are the differences between the one bill strategy and the two bill strategy? I mean, how would they actually divvy up this work?
Right. So,
because Trump, just to be clear, Trump said one big beautiful bill, and then he was asked again. He said, "Well, maybe it is two. Maybe it is two." Like, what matters for the president is that his agenda gets across the line.
We've got a lot of different bills flying up in the air and being juggled, right? Mm-hmm. But I think to your point on that, to kind of understand the breakdown in people's minds, think about what we're just talking about here. There's border and energy. They kind of pay for each other. There's not really deficits. These are both core issues Trump ran on. One is actually securing our border. It's deporting people that shouldn't be here. It's securing our nation and keeping it safe. The other part of that is unleashing our energy production, regulatory reform, permitting reform, unleashing the economy. And then you have tax. And so the two bill strategy was a push to do it separated like that, where you do border and energy, stuff that Congress had already drafted up last Congress in H.R. 1 and H.R. 2. So these are bills that the House of Representatives had already painstakingly negotiated with their own caucus, had proven they could pass out of the House chamber. H.R. 1 on energy policy, H.R. 2 on border and immigration policy. And so the idea was to do both of those. We've already negotiated. People have already agreed on it. Do them together. Do it as one bill. Get out the door early. Get good, important wins done.
Put a win on the board.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Here's the thing with tax, and then do tax separately. So tax is a can of worms. And part of this is, talk about special interests, there's an enormous amount of special interests in those expiring tax provisions, both good and bad. The deficits, at least on paper from the bill, are enormous. And so you would need to convince a certain number of members of Congress that either the growth from the tax cuts will pay for the deficits, or the tariffs will pay for it, or some other combination, or that the deficits are worth it because you're allowing people to keep the money that they've earned. But, that also gets into the politics around the SALT caucus. And SALT, of course, is a deduction that specifically finances and subsidizes. Basically, think of Manhattan lawyers. You have to be in very high tax blue states. You have to make a lot of money as a wage worker, and that's really who SALT benefits.
Well, and beyond that, you're just incentivizing states to have high taxes. The federal government is
Absolutely.
Paying for the California governor's incompetence.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
And so, you have and that's just a handful of issues. The tax space has 100 of these. Mm-hmm. So that was the thought, was if you do two bills, You can bank the early wins on the stuff we've already negotiated that are core to what Trump ran on, border and energy, regulations, et cetera, and then do a later bill in the year that is just tax, where you can have a real conversation with the conference and everybody else and work things out.
And the reason that you can do two bills, people know that you can usually only do one budget reconciliation bill per year, is because the first one would be a retroactive fiscal year, and then the tax bill would be fiscal year 2025.
Precisely. Yep.
Okay.
And actually, if you want to get creative here, you could actually envision doing 3 bills in a year by drawing in the next year's budget resolution to this year as well. So we could do that if we wanted to or needed to, right? But the one bill approach, of course, is the inverse of what we're just talking about. It's actually saying, well, let's hold everybody's priorities hostage for everybody else's priorities. And that's kind of what's going on there. Is that you have people who are pushing to say, and to be fair, a lot of these are those special interests in the tax world who are saying, well, I need to get this done. I'm concerned that it won't get done in general, or if we just do a tax only bill. And so let's just hold border and energy hostage and get all the things we want. Now, there are genuinely good people as well who support a one bill strategy. Obviously, Trump had talked about before he was for it before he was against it, as we would say, right? But part of that is it's a little bit of the politics of, are you concerned that Congress would do one bill and get lazy and not do the second bill? Is there concern that if you break it up into 2 bills, some of the good provisions get stripped out of the tax bill along with the bad provisions? So this is the dance. And in fact, what they're doing right now at the Winter Palace, Mar-a-Lago, is negotiating exactly this and taking a temperature of the Congress to see exactly what their appetite is, how many bills, how much appetite they have to kind of do this process through the year, or whether we actually can just do it right and do it all together in one bill.
Yeah, and this is what has always kind of concerned me, is that there's a lot of special interests that seem like they can hold the gun to the Congress's head and say, give me what you want or you're going to get nothing. And I think we had Ralph Norman in here a few weeks ago and he was saying I prefer a 2-bill strategy. And my concern before we actually started getting down to business in Washington was, well, if you go forward with a 2-bill strategy, what you're going to end up with is a subverted process where we get basically what we got last time around, right? We got the Tax Cuts and Job Act. And then Trump couldn't get border funding, triggers a shutdown and declares emergencies in order to get the funds to build the wall.
Yeah.
And had zero help from Paul Ryan.
Yep.
And so my number one concern coming out of the gate was, if you do a 2-bill process, it's actually going to be flipped. That the tax and the special interests were going to assert themselves, and then border and energy, because it was kind of a 1-for-1 trade, we'll just wait on doing that. And there's all sorts of optical problems. There's all sorts of order of operations problems with that policy approach. But I was just afraid that that's how it was going to go. And now it seems like the 2-bill strategy cannot be subverted by a switch in, okay, we're going to do taxes first and wait for energy and border. But now it just seems like regardless if it's a 1 bill or a 2 bill, somebody's going to be holding the gun.
Somebody is always holding the gun in Congress. I think your fears are well founded on that one. I think the more interesting thing is that they could mechanically do tax first if they wanted to. I think what's almost more interesting about it is that the tax people don't want to do that. And so I think different from 2017, in 2017, they had a sense of we can just run the table, do what we want, and at the end of the day, do nothing on border and immigration enforcement. Now what's happening is they understand that the border policies, the immigration policies, are what the base voted for, that this is actually where the base is, that this is what they care about most, that this is the thing that is most essential to the essence of the country, of who we are as a country, and preserving that. And so they actually are the ones advocating for a 1-bill approach, precisely because they're afraid that regardless of the order you do it in, if you try doing tax alone, they'll get screwed. And so they're trying to put the gun to the head of the immigration people and the people who care about that. So I think the fact that the tax people are advocating for that is actually the most interesting thing that's happened kind of in the local politics, the inside baseball politics almost.
Yeah, and that's just the Republican side of the aisle. Of course, you have a whole nother party and a whole nother apparatus, a much bigger apparatus. And until November, it was a much more powerful apparatus. But maybe Trump's victory broke that monopoly, we could say, or the oligopoly over power in Washington, D.C. Nevertheless, they're still major players. They still got a lot of money. They still got a lot of power. Democrats, how are they going to blow this thing up or try to blow this thing up?
They're going to try to pull out all the stops that they can. They're going to try to demonize everything, attack everything that's going on. They're going to try to offer, in fact, they've been doing this. They're going to try to offer bipartisan permitting reform bills and be like, well, why don't you just do a 60-vote bill with us? What they're not telling you up front is that permitting bill that they've got is only for electricity transmission and for nothing else. And you might say, well, why would you do that? Oh, that's right. Solar panels, wind farms, things that need a lot of transmission because they're terribly inefficient.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's stuff like that, right? Where the Democrats are already trying to kind of go to the Republicans and say, well, why don't we just do a 60-vote bill? You can leave all of this politics behind, leave reconciliation behind, and do a very watered down bill to go down below the table to show how watered down the bill is.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of what they're doing, right? And in fact, some of that I think is kind of interesting is Democrats are doing a little less of the in-your-face attacks on this, and they're doing a lot more of that kind of the siren song of just come do a watered-down bill that you can do with us. That's part of what's going on right now.
Yeah, and they are delaying Trump's nominees right now for no other reason than they don't want the president to have a national security team. This is after they started, I don't know, 2 wars over
At
their
least,
time. At least.
Yeah. That we know of.
Yeah. And here they are just delaying just to delay. How could they delay this process if they wanted to? Of course, they're trying to dangle carrots in front of Republicans and hoping that they bite at them, because there is something about the mentality of a Republican senator, especially that says, oh, well, bipartisan legislation, that's bipartisan. This is upholding the sanctity of the institution. This is what the American people sent me to Washington to do, is to work with people. Well, no, they sent you to Washington, D.C. because of the agenda that the Republican Party was talking about. And the Republican Party's agenda over the last 4 years hasn't been one of détente, I don't think, with the left. It's only become more aggressive. Whether you support that agenda or not, I think you can agree with my assessment.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But nevertheless, like, if Republicans don't bite, if they're not stupid and go for something watered down, they still have a lot of tools in the toolkit.
Oh, absolutely. So I to that point on bipartisan, my code word on this, right, is, if you really think of it, there are 3 parties in the room. There's the Democrats, the Republicans, and then there's the American people. And so when you hear bipartisan, what I want you to think is a Dem-Republican uniparty deal, where the third party, the American public, is very much not at the table. Mm-hmm. Whenever I hear bipartisan, that's what I always think is going on. And usually I'm right about that, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, here's some things that the roadblocks they can pull out. Actually delaying the nominations of what you're talking about pushes out the timeline of when the Senate could even begin working on a reconciliation bill. And if you stretch that long enough, they're going to run into the expiration of the CR in mid-March, and you have another government shutdown fight. And so you got to deal with that first. That takes time. Then the debt ceiling is going to be hit, and you got to take out time to deal with that. And so they can kind of stretch between nominations and the funding fight and the debt limit fight. They can kind of stretch this out to the point where reconciliation is something that would be hard for the Senate to have time on the floor to deal with until the summer or later, right? And if you're dealing with a reconciliation bill in the summer or in the fall, then it's very delayed from dealing with things now and getting things done in the first minute. And so I think that's a lot of their strategy on that. And part of it is to do that while they're trying, of course, using all this time to try to get a toehold in the messaging fight and to try to pick off weak Republicans that they think they can get to do the bipartisan bill. So it's, I think, their strategy on this is kind of delaying tactic and then trying to pick people off.
Delaying tactics and trying to pick people off. And they've been somewhat successful in that. Of course, Mitch McConnell voting against Secretary Hegseth's confirmation, which is always a cause of concern. But, of course, everyone's going to be keeping their eyes on President Trump and what he says, everything that he says. They're going to be keeping an eye on Speaker Johnson and how Speaker Johnson is trying to manage his conference. They're going to be keeping an eye on Leader Thune and how he comes into this role after, Mitch McConnell, frankly, after years of operational security and strength, I mean, he left Thune in quite a weak position with the rest of the conference because the conference was consistently bucking the will of the former majority leader. But other key members of Congress to keep an eye on as we leave this conversation and continue to keep an eye on all things budget reconciliation?
No, absolutely. So I think Chip Roy is certainly one of those to look at. So Chip Roy, of course, is, I would say in some ways, kind of the spiritual leader in many ways of the Freedom Caucus. But beyond that, Chip is really the one who forced the issue about the debt ceiling, who forced an agreement about actually cutting spending, both dealing with the deep state, but also just the theft of hard-earned American dollars that then goes to woke bureaucrats and DEI and all this other stuff. Chip is in many ways, I think, going to be the gatekeeper on a lot of some of these one-off questions about exactly how much crap the Uniparty wants to pull in a one or two bill strategy. So I think he's certainly key to look at. There's a few other players around. Jason Smith is the chair of the Ways and Means Committee in the House. That's the Tax Committee. Crapo as well in the Senate is the chair of the Finance Committee, which is the Tax Committee in the Senate. They're, of course, already very deeply engaged in the whole process. They're going to be the key to look at, in part because so much of the bill that's on the table is going to be in the tax policy space. But you'll have other people that come up. Obviously, there's a handful of members who care about the SALT deduction and all those sorts of things. So we'll see more of these key players as things unfold more.
Richard, thank you for joining the Signal Sit Down. We might have to bring you on sooner than we might have other guests on, because this is going to be the thing to watch for the next year and a half.
Absolutely. Well, and again, pleasure. Thank you for having me on. And again, I can't stress enough, this is our shot. We can't blow it. We owe it to the American public.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sit Down. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.